Well, you know this phrase, the Asian century. And much of the intellectual and thinking luminaries of Australia and elsewhere have told us it's the Asian century. The government even released a white paper under the previous government on how Australia could keep up in an Asian-dominated future. But what if? What if it's actually the Australian century? Well, Asher Judah is the author of a book released by Connor Court Publishers in Australia. It's simply called The Australian Century. Asher Judah currently is Research Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Asher Judah, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Asher, you are, interestingly, very critical of the Asian Century White Paper, saying it epitomised all that is wrong about how Australia thinks about its future. Roll out your argument. Roll out your thinking for me, if you would, please.
Sure, and thanks for having me on the show. Look, the Australian Century book is about Australia's long-term future. It talks about a positive vision for our country, and it's a book for people who love Australia. The Asian Century White Paper outlined how Australia as a country could fit into the narrative of Asia growing and becoming more important in the world. And my main criticism of that is that for so much of our history, we've talked about how Australia fits into the story of another part of the world, whether it was the British Empire, America's dominance last century, or the forecast dominance of Asia in this century. And a country that's got confidence in itself and a good vision for its future doesn't plan its future around other people. It writes its own script, its own story, and then goes about achieving it. And so the Asian Century White Paper said this is how Australia fits into the rise of Asia. And I think the mistake we made is not saying, well, how do we plan the rise of Australia and what do we need to do to get there?
So it lacked vision. It lacked an Australian vision.
I think so. And look, it had some strategic flaws in it as well. The Asian Century White Paper talked about the rise of Asia as a great economic and trading opportunity. But what it did is it ignored 34% of the world that's also developing, the rest of the world. There's hundreds of millions of people, billions of people developing across South America, Africa, the Middle East, which weren't included in the white paper as potential trade opportunities for Australia. And importantly, it forgot about the additional 100 million people that are going to emerge in the middle class in North America over this century. And for a country like Australia that already has a free trade agreement with North America, they are actually an easier trading opportunity than perhaps trying to crack access to the Indian market, for example.
I'll come to the global middle class, which is quite an interesting discussion for my mind. But let me just keep going on this one point for a bit longer. It's almost like you're saying that we were doing something that used to happen 150 years ago. The Asian Century White Paper was kowtowing to Asia or to China in a sense. And I'm using that phrase deliberately because it used to be quite a provocative phrase, kowtow.
Well, I think it shows we lacked confidence to plan out our own path. I guess countries, if you look at them as people, it's the sort of behaviour you'd expect from a teenager. But we're getting into our 20s and our 30s now as a country in terms of its development. It's now time to start strike out on our own, come up with our own ideas and plot our own destiny. Every country goes through that phase, and it's about time Australia grew up.
In Australia's early years, federation, immediately post-federation, we did seem to have that cultural atmosphere, that cultural milieu, very Australian-focused, proud but not arrogant about being Australian, confident but not patriotic, yet forward-looking. Is that what you're referring to?
I think, look, we've had bursts of patriotism and confidence where we had a big, bold plan for our country. And I think in the last few decades we've become a bit introspective. We're more navel-gazing at ourselves. That's often a side effect of prosperity. When there's nothing going terribly wrong, you tend to just take it easy. Other countries around the world have had shocks, have had deep recessions or threats to their national security, which have potentially losing their sovereignty, and that shocked them into action. So I think it's a side effect of that. But the trick for us this century is to see how the world's changing, to assess what that means for us globally, and then to reorganise ourselves to maximise our response.
If you just turn on your mobile phone or your wireless, I'm talking with Asher Judah about his book, The Australian Century. Asher is a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. This is 612 ABC Brisbane. Asher Judah's book, The Australian Century, is published by Connor Court Publishers in Australia. Tell me about the rise of the global middle class and its significance potentially for us. Because whenever I read anything about the middle class today, I read that it's shrinking in Western democracies. Where is the global middle class increasing, Asher?
Well, globally, it's going to be exploding in the decades ahead. It already is surging. At present, we have about 1.8 billion people who are defined as middle class. And middle class globally means someone who spends between 20 and 50 American dollars a day. So after they've covered their food, their shelter, and their clothing, they've got a little bit of money left over for recreation, education, healthcare. That number, that 1.8 billion, is going to grow to 4.9 billion over the next 2 to 3 decades if trends continue. Now, what that's going to mean is there's going to be an explosion of consumers and an explosion of demand for the things that middle-class people need and need for their lifestyle that they want. So what's that going to mean? In terms of raw materials, it's going to mean we're going to need thousands of cities to be modernised and developed around the world. In China, there'll be 200 cities of over 1 million people alone. They will need 3 cities the size of Sydney by 2030 to be built every single year. 100,000 skyscrapers are required around the world over the next few decades. They're going to want different things to do with their time. They're going to need recreational activity. They're going to need legal advice, financial advice. They're going to want better healthcare and education. So there's a massive service opportunity there. Demand for electricity and energy is going to explode as well. Very high demand forecasts are outlined in my book in terms of what India and places like China are going to need. But globally, we're talking about a 33% surge in primary energy output, which is the equivalent of Europe and America, OECD countries combined, in the next couple of decades alone. And finally, there's agriculture. The wealthier you become, your diet changes. Red meat's going to become more fashionable and in higher demand across the entire world. So that's a great opportunity for our red meat producers. But it's also going to mean a lot of our agricultural products will have this growing global stomach to fill. And so there'll be great opportunities there. So that massive explosion in demand of middle-class consumers will, in many ways, offset some of the declines that we're forecasting in Europe.
Asher, you are calling on Australia essentially to maximise our economic performance through an overhaul of how we manage our nation. So how can we use our position to greater leverage? How can we do this?
Well, I think it's important to recognise what kind of country we are. Australia, for a lot of its history, has always viewed itself as a continental nation like the United States. We were a big landmass. We've got cities on the edges of it, and therefore, we view ourselves as a big island. But if you look at a map of Australia at night from orbit, you'll see where Australians really live and where our economy operates, and you'll find that it's a collection of urban centres around the country, in which there's actually only 100 with a population of 10,000 people. Now, when you have a country that's like that, that's spread out as much as Australia, you find that the definition of ourselves is not actually continental. It's actually we're an archipelago of urban centres. We're an archipelago of cities that are spread out across a landmass which is so large that connecting these centres up isn't always practical. And so in a century in which there'll be a surge of global demand for a range of products, we need to organise ourselves so we're best able to not necessarily connect with the other major cities in Australia, but to connect with the markets overseas. And for a lot of our history, we've talked about, train lines between cities and highways between our major cities. And this century, what we need to do is we need to maximise the infrastructure that connects us globally. So that's our ports, our airports, and even things like the NBN, which allows us to communicate electronically. Because the choice for us is connecting up 23 million people really well, or connecting up 23 million people with 3, 4, 5 billion people. And I think the later option is where the biggest gains will be for us. And as a result, it requires a different form of thinking. Do
we want to as a nation? You don't often get the feeling that Australians are expansive in their thinking. In fact, there's been recently a sort of a strain of almost we want to reduce our impact in the world. How do you see it?
I think that attitude that you talk about is cyclical. There are times when we want to be heavily engaged in the world, and there are other times we want to take a bit of a backward step and maybe breathe in. I think the experiences in the Middle East in the last decade or so in terms of our military involvement has made us a little bit more cautious about global engagement. But, after World War II, we were very much keen to engage in the world because I guess perhaps the lack of engagement around the world by key powers brought about some of those troubles. I think at the moment, what's concerning most Australians is how we handle population growth, how we manage our cities, density, congestion, affordability. Those are big growing pain problems, and as a result, people tend to turn inwardly and want those addressed, and I think they should be high priorities for all governments. And I think once we sort those matters out and at least alleviate some of those tensions, we'll start to turn our attention externally again about how we can influence the world and how we can better engage with it.
Is there any such thing as Australian exceptionalism? You often hear that phrase in terms of the United States, United States exceptionalism. Barack Obama has disavowed it quite publicly, and there's a real debate in the United States, partly as a release of a film by a guy called Dinesh D'Souza, who's done a very successful documentary called America, Imagine the World Without Her. I think it's become the third biggest selling doco of all time. And I think the book is number one on the New York bestseller list now. But is there any such thing as Australian exceptionalism? I think it was Mark Twain who used the phrase, my country right or wrong. But you don't hear that today. You hear the phrase, my country wrong.
Look, I think the Australian century will be our opportunity this century to become an exceptional country. There's no doubt we're special in the world, and everybody who's migrated here, I think the vast majority would agree with that, and everybody who lives here would certainly think it's a unique place. But I think the definition of exceptionalism requires a country to exercise disproportionate power to its size, have a record of high achievement across a variety of fields, have a special sense of identity, operate outside the norms of other countries. The rules don't apply to us is another way of saying that, and have a unique self-confidence. And I think America today is an example of a country that operates like that. In previous centuries, it was the European empires. When they conquered the world, they set the rules, they wrote the international rules, and they were small countries that dominated large populations. So that was their experience with exceptionalism. I think this century, as a result of the rise of the global middle class, that explosion of demand for products that we have an abundance of, will supercharge our economy. It will enrich our communities. And much like the gold rush that helped Melbourne and Perth grow, and many ways like the iron ore boom and the coal boom that is helping Queensland and Western Australia grow now, this rise of the middle class will unleash a golden age for us, a new gold rush. But unlike the previous gold rush, which was in landlocked goldfields, it will be in an archipelago of cities and regional centres and mines and gas wells and farms, which will create an era of where we will start to display those traits I talked about high achievement. The rules don't apply to us, a special sense of identity, because once you have momentum that just doesn't seem to stop, well, then the rules don't really apply to you. And I think that's where we're heading, but we've got to get the foundations right to reach that point, and that's the big challenge over the next few decades.
I'm speaking with Asher Judah. Asher is the author of a book published by Connor Court Publishing in Australia called The Australian Century. Asher is a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. This is 612 ABC Brisbane. Asher, you've got an interesting little chapter in the book called Australia, the Undiscovered Country, where you, under a subheading of the West Cultural Timekeeper, you focus on how Australia is unique in its colonial form. Now, I hadn't thought or seen of this or even heard this really discussed, that how actually colonialism has produced something unique and beneficial in Australia as a sort of a cultural timekeeper. Just explain that for me, if you would, please.
Well, Australia is unique in the world in that it's one of the few land masses where only one European country settled. So all of our colonies were based on British settlement, and that's not the case in North America. It's not the case in South America. And as a result of our settlement culture, we've tended to have a unique sense of unity in a way which maybe a country like Canada doesn't, where it's sort of half French, half English in its history. What's important when we look at Australia's place in the world is to look at countries as if they are individuals or part of family trees. Now, Australia's family tree spreads from Britain, and we have brothers and sisters in that family tree. We have the United States, we have New Zealand, and we have Canada. And that family tree is important because our culture is connected to that in a way which few other countries can identify with. And what makes Australia special in the world is that its mother, Britain, was a superpower. And now its older brother, the United States, is the world's superpower today. And so that gives us a leveraged place in world affairs because our culture is similar, our language is similar, our customs are similar, our form of government, our calendar, our approach to trade and business is similar. And because English is so important in the world, it's the language of science, the internet, commerce, a lot of politics, computing. We even though we're not Americans or Brits, we are leveraged because of their influence over the centuries. And that's very important for our influence in the world and for what's going to set the tone for how the world interacts this century with the various parts. The other thing to keep in mind as a country that was settled by Europeans is that we've always had an immigrant culture. There's never really been one culture in Australia that was across the entire country. Even the Aboriginal communities had very big variances in how they interacted in their rules and customs. So as a result of our experience with new immigrant waves coming here, we integrate new people very well in a way which not every country can. In countries like Europe and France and Germany, to be French or German, you've got to have been there for a few generations before you're actually recognised as a Frenchman or a German. But in Australia, you can become an Australian very quickly once you're national. We don't have a nativist approach to citizenship. So as a result, if you work hard, you obey the laws, you pay your taxes and you keep to yourself, we will embrace you and we'll cherish you. And that is a unique trait because it allows us to absorb migrants better and it also helps them reach their full potential faster. And that's a big challenge for a lot of countries. And it's something that is a legacy of that colonial history.
I'll let people read the book themselves if they want to read more. Asher, thanks very much. Good to speak with you.